Welcome to Humanity Rising. I'm Tom Eddington. Jim Garrison's away this week. Delighted to have you with us for day 3 on our dialogue series this week on the future of God. I'd love to welcome my co-host and friend and colleague, Michael Putz, to join us and help us kick off today, Michael. Great to be back with you today and really excited for another engaging conversation on the future of God.
Thank you, Tom. Today's session, it's a real privilege. It's a very special session for me because I get to introduce. First, I have to say a few things before the frame the session. I get to introduce someone special to me that I really know who's done some remarkable work. And today's session is we had a week about where this week's about the future of God. It's really saying, is there a future of God in a world that's been saturated in modernism, postmodernism, and that really critiques the very sense of meaning. We're in a meaning crisis, and we're at the very moment we're facing a meta crisis, and we have a meaning crisis, and we don't have the shared collective infrastructure to really grapple together with the meta crisis. And postmodernism, as an example, sort of even undercuts the very idea of creating a shared narrative, a shared sense of meaning that people can rally around. And so the question is, how do we move forward? We're not going backward to a pre-modern world. We're moving forward into a postmodern world. How do we make meaning together? How do we create the community in the sense of purpose and shared meaning that's essential to rally around the challenges we have? And I'm just going to share just for a few minutes some of the slides we talked about in day 1 to sort of frame the conversation before we bring Paul onto the talk here. So, okay. Here we go. All right. So basically, we're talking about is basically, can theism offer answers to the meaning crisis? And that was the goal of the week here. And what we talked about on Monday was the future of meaning making is developmental, participatory, and relational. And more specifically, one of the things that John Vervaeke, which I think is an incredibly important and powerful resource here, talked about is the fact that he talked about this 4 ways of knowing, 4 ways that are critical as we develop a way of making meaning for our postmodern future. And he talked about the fact that there's propositional ways of knowing, procedural, perspectival, and participatory. And he really emphasized that the West overemphasized the propositional beliefs, creeds, and the procedural. Not that they're not important, but the West has overemphasized them at the cost of the perspectival and the participatory. And I think that all the people this week, including Paul, very much are about trying to create communities that are perspectival, participatory, and working together collectively to try to come up to discover, blaze trails through the current meaning-making desert we're in today to find ways forward to making meaning in a new way, in a postmodern way. And I mentioned developmental because, basically the critiques of modernism and postmodernism from that level of development, that level of adult development and consciousness, is either very critical of any concept of theism or even thinks the concept of theism is really just a non-starter. It's not possible. And I think what's important for us is to understand the critiques of modernism and postmodernism, that we're not going back to a pre-modern sense of spirituality or religion or a concept of God. We're moving forward. And I think all the people this week are deeply steeped in that. And I know Paul and his community has been working with people who are trying to make their way authentically through the current environment. They're trying to go forward in the 21st century, and they're not trying to go back to the 19th century. And they're trying to do this in a way that is authentic to themselves, to their hearts, to the people within their communities, but also authentic to their minds, all at the same time. And it's a rigorous process of people of high integrity. And Paul has been one of the people who's been shepherding people who are trying to go through this process, especially people who are younger, who are, let's say, under 40, who've been growing up in a world where that that's been steeped in modern and postmodern thought. They may have no spiritual tradition to rebel against or to adopt. There's been a poverty of language out there for meaning making. And I think people like John Vervaeke have been giving us frameworks for doing that. But we have to do the work. And I think Paul has been doing that work for quite some time. And so I'm going to introduce Paul. I'll come on the screen here. So Paul VanderKlay has been a Christian Reformed minister in Sacramento for geez, almost, he's been there. I think you've been in Sacramento for like 27 years, I believe, right, from 1997. But you've been a Christian Reformed minister for like 35 years, I believe, or about something like that. I want to say Paul grew up with a father who was a Christian Reformed minister, but had a special ministry. He had been an inner city ministry that was always from the very beginning committed to civil rights, working inside the inner city, has always been, by definition, inclusive, of different cultures, different races. It was just the way Paul was raised in the tradition, and I think it's very important to understand that just how much the Christian Reformed tradition and other traditions have been on the forefront of basically social justice, things that are very important to people today. Paul's been living that process. He's worked overseas with disadvantaged communities, done overseas missionary work, and so he's been out there doing the work of the Gospels for a very long time. And what's happened was that about 2018, through a series of events Paul can talk about if he wishes to, he basically had been trying to use technology, like when blogging came out, he was on blogs. He's been using technology to try to reach people inside of his community, outside of his community. And one day he had a small internet channel, and through a series of events, it went from having 10 or 15 subscribers to having 1,000 subscribers, and now 30,000 subscribers. And he basically ended up developing an accidental, I would say, ministry to protect all people, but basically people who are under the age of 40, a lot of them who don't have a tradition of meaning making, that they even believe that there's no meaning making thing on the shelf to grab, and they've been out there seeking. And through something Paul calls this little corner of the internet, which is a confederation, a flotilla of people who are finding meaning together. And Paul's been one of the organizers, a hub and spoke of this community. There's been a robust community of people who are trying to navigate the meaning crisis together. And so what I think is really special today is that we had Luke Healy yesterday talk about his participatory mystical practices for a community of people who I think found their sense of meaning in the 21st century. But Paul's talking about helping people who are on that journey who haven't arrived yet, and helping them blaze a trail together. Paul's not here to offer the answers. Paul's really trying to convene a process to help people discover this process. And I just want people to learn about what Paul's doing and to understand the work of all the other people and other people who are on this journey, because you may have people who are your friends, your neighbors, family members who are going on this journey together too, even if you found your own sense of meaning. So, but Paul, I wanted to introduce you and say I'm so grateful to have you here, and I'd like to hear the journey of this little corner of the internet and what you've been discovering in the rubble of modernity and postmodernity.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you. I really was sort of an accidental tourist on this. I had been playing with YouTube because a disabled member of my congregation named Freddie wanted to do a TV show with me. He had been going down to public access, and so I just did little YouTube videos with him. He liked to rap, and we talk about sports, and we do that. And then Jordan Peterson came on the scene, and I began reading comment threads and Reddit threads about Jordan Peterson, and noticed a real hunger and a longing that people were suddenly interested. They were fans of someone like Sam Harris, And now suddenly they're interested in the Bible and religion. And I thought that is very strange. And so I made a vid, and Jordan Peterson started his biblical series. And because I've been a Christian minister for a long time, I know a little something about the Bible. So I made some comments on some of his observations on his biblical series. And then I began to get emails and people approaching me wanting to talk. And because I'm not a theologian primarily, I'm a pastor, I just started having conversations with people. And that, as my videos continued to be watched, that snowballed. And I very quickly had a lot of conversations with a lot of people. And this was a change because, sort of as a Christian minister in a place like Sacramento, California, a lot of people are sort of post-Christian. They might go to yoga studios on Sunday. They do a lot of different things on Sunday, but not very much into God or church, and have a little aging congregation. But suddenly I had many, many people who wanted to talk with me. And so then I was talking to people over Zoom, and I started sharing some of these conversations with permission. And then I began to recognize how so many of these people, they tended to be millennials and younger, and mostly male. And they were depressed. And they were telling me how, watching Jordan Peterson, they were less depressed. But I knew that that was only going to get them so far, and that what they really needed was community. They needed to be around other people that could help sustain this in them. Otherwise, they would probably slide back down into their old practices, into their old patterns, and the depression would reemerge. And the more I did this, the more I realized that the depression was because of nihilism. I remember having lunch with a guy who, he used to be a Christian. He was training for ministry. And then at some point, he just couldn't believe it anymore. And so he became, in his words, a new atheist. He was listening to Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and all of this. But then he married and had a daughter, and looked at his daughter and said, my worldview says this child of mine is of no greater value than any other mammal on the planet, rats, rodents, animals. But I look at my daughter and I simply can't believe that, because I would give my life for my daughter. Why is there such a disparity between my worldview and how I feel? And many of the people were not ready for church. They found church difficult because they didn't believe everything that churches said they needed to believe. But they needed a sense of community. And so what I started with a friend of mine was something called Estuary, which I talk about being church adjacent, because often it takes a little bit of infrastructure. You need a room, you need a place, you need a convener who can be there. And it actually sounds a little bit like what you all have done with this little COVID community that's arisen. But we needed to be able to structure conversations where people could talk about what's meaningful, and they could share their lives. And then I also realized that my church people needed this too, because the church people tended to they didn't have the same kind of meaning crisis. They derived a lot of meaning from their religious participation, from their religious beliefs. They didn't have sort of the classic symptomology that John Vervaeke talked about in terms of the meaning crisis, sort of nihilistic induced depression, aimlessness, especially for young men. Young women sort of have two trajectories. They can sort of take the modernist trajectory of a career, or the traditional trajectory of motherhood. But men were just sort of aimless. And so some of them got excited about career, but they found that hollow at some point. So they needed a space to sort of work through and talk about things that were meaningful to them. And again, I very quickly discovered that many of these people, they would sort of, because they saw Jordan Peterson, he talked about the Bible, they thought they would go to church for a try, but they realized that church and them were on totally different pages, and they couldn't connect. And so Estuary became a space where you can talk about anything. And the group, however, to keep it from just being soapboxes for various people and their individual hobby horses or needs, the group itself could define the conversation, the meaningful conversation they wanted to have. And I noted that both church people and people who are not Christian and don't intend to be Christian, but just need a community, want to be seen and heard and loved, suddenly could have a space. And this meant a niche for the church too, because the church in many ways was siloed. And the church couldn't reach beyond itself because it was sort of hemmed in by its own propositional tyranny, and couldn't really connect with people outside the church who didn't have all the language and beliefs that church people had. And so estuary became sort of a place, a boundary water where both could come together and they could actually have meaningful conversations and begin to develop community between each other and use some of the resources that church had, but without some of the fences and barriers that churches sort of have to have in order to maintain themselves. And so my channel has been usually just me sharing my thoughts, and people would, find some of those thoughts interesting, some of those thoughts not interesting, but it was the community that grew up around my channel, and then people starting to do similar things with YouTube to connect and to create community. And it sort of became a very interesting community where you had believers from lots of different Christian traditions, and then people who were sort of post-Christian and sometimes a little anti-Christian with no propositional beliefs, and then others who were just sort of not sure about where they fit, but knew they needed a tribe and they needed a space, and they found that, well, they found a lot of hospitality, and so off it went.
Oh, without, at the risk of over analyzing the metaphor of the estuary, I think of an estuary as a place where there's birth, a place where there's feeding. It's a place where the brackish and the freshwater meet.
Yep.
And I'd love for you to just share a bit more about the estuary as a metaphor for your work.
So I had been doing this for a couple of years, and a lot of people were sort of waiting for me to unveil a program, or maybe a new kind of church, or maybe a new thing that they could join. And some people were getting quite frustrated. And so one person, just sort of really pushed me one day and said, where do you want people to go? What do you want people to do? And I had long had this idea of estuary in mind, because I pastor a church in a distressed area of town. As Michael said, my father's ministry, my grandfather's ministry, we've always had a heart for people on the fringes who struggle, people who can't fit in. And I would regularly work with homeless people. People would knock on my door because they needed $20 for gas or food, or they wanted money for beer or drugs or something. And they're just looking for something. And I thought, there's a never-ending group of people who seem to be interested in my money or my attention. But why are there so few people interested in sort of the thing I major in here at church? And then when I started having people come into my church and visit because of my YouTube channel, it was very obvious that there was a big disconnect. And I didn't have any way to bridge that connect. And estuary was just sort of an image. I live right next to the California Delta, which is this massive estuary that leads into the San Francisco Bay and then out the Golden Gate Bridge. And all the time when I go on vacation, I'm always going down the coast, and you have all of these rivers and streams that come into the sea. And you're right, it's this beautiful, amazingly productive space. There are little tidal pools, and it's just a wonderful thing. And I thought, this is exactly the image of what I want, where in estuary, and this sort of frustrates a lot of church people, because church people are like, oh, this is a growth strategy where we can increase and save our churches. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to let people be people, and we're just going to give them space. We're going to practice hospitality, and we're going to let relationships grow. And because churches, especially in a place like California, are in such distress, they're sort of open to that at this point. They've sort of given up trying to become a successful enterprise. They love the church themselves. They have many of their neighbors and children who have walked away from it, and they just want to help build bridges. And so estuary became a place. And some people will go into estuary and say, well, maybe I'd like to think about what church has to say. part of the dirty little secret that is hard to know, let's say if you look at church promotional material, is that within churches themselves, there's an enormous diversity. Even though a church says these are all the things we believe and promote these beliefs, so many people in church are either unclear or they don't want or they don't agree with those beliefs, but they stay in those church communities because it's their people. And, and that's, I was just in a new Costco opened up in another edge of town, and I was looking around it last night, and I thought, the demographics in this Costco and this little community in Sacramento are different from the demographics in the other Costcos. It's an astoundingly diverse community, and the propositions become barriers for a lot of people that are probably not surmountable very quickly, and in some ways are sort of a false facade when you look at real churches in California. So Estuary isn't a YouTube show. Estuary is fundamentally cameras off in person. Now, there are some channels. So I started this channel. A lot of other channels sort of started behind me because I was unable to keep up with all of the need for community and conversation. So people sort of mimicked what I did. And so that's where we have this corner of the internet, which is sort of the online version. But the offline version, I think in many ways is also extremely important because there are most people don't want to have their face on YouTube for very good reasons. And most of what people really want and need to talk about shouldn't be on YouTube for very good reasons. And so you need a place of just 6 or 8 people, cameras off. And when I know Estuary is working, we actually have an Estuary movement in the UK. So that is there too. But cameras off. I really know Estuary is working when someone sort of discloses something. Like last week at our weekly Estuary at our church, people were talking about, this is my relationship with my father. I was quite a bit more low in openness than my father, and my father was, and so for years I was embarrassed by my father, and now my father's getting older, and now that I'm getting older, I understand my father better, and I'm, my relationship with my father is improving, and that's really healing in my life. And when I hear things like that in an Estuary group, I know that, we are facilitating deep healing in people, and whatever spiritual path they take in the future, I can't be in control of that, but at least I will be able to facilitate their next step and give them a community where they might not agree with ideas of the divinity of Christ or many of the other Christian things that Christians obviously believe, but they know the church to be a place where they're loved, hospitality is extended, and they can actually go there for a meaningful conversation, not just help with an electric bill or a food crisis.
Yeah, beautiful. I love the metaphor.
Right. So you can just get a taste of what I know about Paul from that brief discussion here. It's and there's a tremendous humility. This is really, the true sense of ministry is it's a calling as opposed to an ego-driven project. Paul's not trying to create a mega church. He's not Joel Osteen or something like that. This is basically the world calling us, sometimes whether we like it or not, and you respond to the call. That's what I sort of see, Paul. And you've got some creative ideas, but that there's been this tension between the church you have and, like you said before, aren't you going to help create more people in the pews, or more churches, or church plant, or create a new denomination? No, it's not what it's about, right? And I think you said before, there's so many people who they may need the benefits of the gospel, as you would call it, but they're not interested in being Christian or anything like that. And everyone can be. But what's happened is that what's interesting, Paul, is that in some ways there's this Estuary allows people to have healing and togetherness and be together and create community. But out of this, there's self-organizing. These people who may have been in need of help, who are now self-organizing and helping others. and who are also self-organizing and coming up with the answers. You said before you're not much of a theologian and stuff like that, right? Yeah, you actually know quite a bit about theology, but that's not what you're trying to do. But the point is, in some ways, this community of people are trying to help others who are through the meaning crisis are discovering new things and even maybe teaching you some things and making new discoveries. Those who are being helped are helping each other and also pioneering. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit about some of the things that this community has learned, the discoveries they've made. And I want to say this in the concept of, I think when I listen to some of your videos and the other people in this, it's a given that the modernity has failed, basically. And, postmodernity sort of swallowed it up, right? The Enlightenment project coming through to the 20th century. People like Nietzsche said, like, hey, God is dead. That's the pre-modern Christian consensus, but the liberal modern consensus has also been consumed in record time. Matter of fact, and one of the things I was trying to say earlier is that we've been through meta crises before. We get all excited about it, but we had like World War I, a depression, and World War II. That sounds worse than what we've been going through now.
Yeah.
But what's different is that the meaning crisis, we don't have our sort of like our social spiritual immune system has been weakened, and the meta crisis is different this time because it gets bigger faster. The changes oh, you're going to show us an estuary here, Stan. So it becomes bigger, faster, and we don't have the horsepower to address it, right? And so I think people are trying to weave their way through this process of they're going, hey, look, modernity is not offering the answers either. And then postmodernity is offered a false promise of that if we get rid of all meaning-making structures that have been limited and sometimes very oppressive. And you were in the forefront of that process, watching the civil rights movement and stuff like that. We've gotten rid of the oppressive side of meaning-making structures. Well, we got rid of all of them. And we threw out all of them in the same time, right? So I'm curious about the people in this little corner of the internet, how they're navigating to, like, I would say, a postmodern consensus.
So you're right. Modernity. So Jesus. So I'll use a biblical story because I'm a minister. Jesus. Jesus is baptized. God speaks from heaven, and then he goes out into the wilderness and he fasts for 40 days. And the devil comes to him and says, "Turn stones into bread." Now, in some ways, that's a picture of modernity, because what modernity is really good at is making bread. Technology, we in the West live in the most food secure space that humanity has ever known. I regularly deal with homeless people, and ironically, because there are two supermarkets right back here that regularly fill their dumpsters full of things that have expired on the shelf, but the food is perfectly good. The homeless people around me, there's plenty of food. Many churches run food bank. There's lots of bread. But what happened in modernity is people then began to learn Jesus' answer. Man does not live on bread alone. And this, of course, is something Dostoevsky saw. And the postmodernists really hammered at this and said, yes, man doesn't live on bread alone. Take away these structures. Okay, but you still need to make meaning. And when I worked with Haitians, for example, in the Dominican Republic, they didn't have a meaning crisis, partly because their lives were so hard. And they simply they had the quest for life was very meaningful. And it's ironic that it's often in places that are food secure that people have meaning crises, because the world told them, if you are food secure, if you are housing secure, if you can find sex partners or at least some way of sexual release, then you will be satisfied. And what they learned is that bread alone doesn't satisfy. Sex alone doesn't satisfy. Affluence alone doesn't satisfy. What can satisfy? And that's then, and then postmodernity comes along basically with a cynical take that says all of these things that offered you satisfactions are simply serving the marketers who market them. And it's like, well, they probably do, but you're not answering the question of what will satisfy my soul. And that's where you begin to see, as we're seeing now, something of a spiritual revival. And people became spiritual but not religious because religion wasn't satisfying them. And so very quickly, people began to recognize that we need some very basic things. And one of the things we need as human beings are each other. And even though we have screens in front of us, screens both give us something of a sense of satisfaction. But if we're only known with screens, we're not really known. And so screens are sort of like relational junk food. You can live on junk food, but your system isn't going to really work. And that doesn't mean you get rid of screens, because ironically, a lot of what I've done is on screens, but I'm always trying to give people something that they can get off the screens for. And most of the people, I think most of us are going to have part of our life on screen and part of our life off screen. And the screens do some things really well, like getting ideas out there and getting propositions out there, ironically. But what the screens don't really do very well is build connection. Now, and that's sort of where a lot of people have been asking in the chat about online. We do have, so this little corner is sort of on one side, which is sort of the online community space, which is super handy because you can be anywhere in the world and participate in this. One of the things that we learned with Estuary is that, for me, I still see roles for on the ground, brick and mortar, spiritual communities. And in a place like California, a lot of these communities are in crisis. They're struggling to be able to keep enough elderly people together and maintain their building. And my church is very much that way too. And actually, if it hadn't been for the generosity of many people who appreciate what I do on screen and actually contribute to my local church, the church wouldn't be open. We wouldn't have survived COVID because we had a lot of elderly members that stopped coming to church at that point. But what I saw is that if you're going to actually facilitate in real life community, there's some very practical, basic things you need. You need a space. And often, sometimes Estuary meetings happen in restaurants, which you can do that. But restaurants tend to be noisy. And the restaurants, you really do have to buy something, and they don't necessarily want you tying up this table for 2-3 hours. But often churches had empty spaces, plenty of chairs, people who understand facilitating small group experiences. What they sort of lacked was the vision to say, you know, you host AA meetings, you host community neighborhood meetings. I know this group isn't necessarily an evangelistic program per se, but why don't you extend a little bit of hospitality to some people that really could just use some better quality relationships in their life? And some churches have said no, but some churches have said, we'll give it a try. And some churches have even used sort of this Estuary protocol, which we use. You can learn about that on the website. They've used this Estuary protocol for their own church groups, because a Bible study tends to sort of line people up of, okay, these are the things you're going to learn about the Bible. Okay, churches should do that. And I do that all the time. That's fine. But one of the things that I've often recognized with Bible study is that people will sort of tolerate the learning component. Some people really want the learning component. But what they're really there for is usually the second component with church Bible studies, which is usually the prayer requests. Okay, what's happened in your life this week? Oh, I had a fight with my wife. Oh, I'm having stress in my job. Oh, I've got these medical things. And then we share about that and we can pray about that. And usually they leave the Bible study not remembering anything that ostensibly they were there to learn. But what they really leave with is a sense of, there's a group of people out there that have my back. They love me. They're there for me. And I want to be there for them. And I think, families are supposed to get that. And for people with intact, healthy families, they do get a sense of that. But now with, my mother lives on the other coast, people live all over the place. Church for me was always sort of another level of family. But for people who say can't necessarily believe all the propositions, this gives them a chance to, well, these estuary people are my family and they care about me. And the people at work, that's all about work. And the people in my neighborhood, well, maybe that's all about my neighborhood. But what I really need is a friend. And this is so much what people need. And there's no cost to it. You basically, and this has sort of been TLC Online as well, you don't need a big YouTube channel. What you just basically have to do is show up for each other. And if you show up for each other, that's what gives you value in the community.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. What's interesting to me is the idea people have sort of said many times, can we get all the benefits of Christianity without the Christian stuff? Without Christ and without the beliefs and without the creeds and all that kind of stuff. And there's so many things that are very, like you said before, there's the social justice message of the Christian church, which people, even if they think Christianity is very different, is an anathema, they really celebrate that. But also, as you said before, this idea of getting a group of people who will care for each other at a deeper level and can disclose to each other. And he said that prayer request word, which is they think that collective process of support is in some ways being heard, and is there a way to do that in a postmodern way for people where they can feel that it's connect? I mean, maybe Ganesh, to where it's been challenging to create these kinds of communities of depth in a purely secular way. Yes. And I was wondering what you had to say about that.
So there's a British, it was a Christian radio ministry called Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. And I've appeared on that once then. And Justin paired me up with a guy who was trying to start basically secular churches, where these are places that you don't need to have any supernatural belief or anything like that. And just secular people could get together. And he said, with the rise of the nuns, the NONESs, and the duns, people who have either said, I'm spiritual but not religious, or I'm done with Christianity, he said, you would think that this would be a heyday for me because you would think that these people would be able to come together. And he's super frustrated because it's never happened. And there have been many attempts to try to found, these like unbelieving churches, atheist churches, and they almost all fail for the most part. And there very much is something sticky about religion. In other words, you're never, those propositions in terms of John Vervaeke's 4 Ps, they're 1/4 of it. And so you're never going to get rid of the propositions. One of the side effects, even though I'm very clear with Estuary that this is not a church growth program, and that I am completely fine with someone coming to Estuary and staying Estuary and never, at least my church, Estuary, meets at 9 a.m. and then we have the worship service at 11. People never wander into the worship service. What has happened, however, is that people have, as a part of this, decided that they wanted to join, as John Vervaeke calls them, legacy religious communities, because we don't, there's lots of theories, but we don't really know why. There is something to the fact that you have to participate in a mythos in order to have this community. And of course, Campbell talked about this and Jordan Peterson talked about this. You need sort of a mythic structure, a mythic narrative story to participate in, because we find those narrative stories deeply meaningful. And you might always have doubts about them. You might say that, well, I'm just going to act as if I'm a Christian. I'm going to hang out around Christians. And some of those people, when they say, I believe Jesus is coming back, they really believe it. I'm not so sure, but I like being in community with these people. And so what people have discovered is that, well, I've probably most of the people that have come back to Christianity because of participating in my networks have gone to the Orthodox churches who are in America, which is very different from my Dutch Calvinist churches. And so some of my denominational people look at this and say, why are you sending people to other aspects of Christianity? And I say, I don't care. For me as a Christian, if they find Jesus somewhere, I'm super happy. Okay. If they find Jesus in the Orthodox or they're Catholic, some people wind up saying, I'm going to try these other churches, and they wind up back in the Christian community that raised them. They had left it, but then they came back, and they sort of say, well, I've got whole lots of other ideas about all of this, but you are my people, and I want to contribute to this community, and I'm going to keep the lights on, and I'm going to keep the machinery running, because for some strange reason, we need a mythos. We need a grand story to inhabit. And even if I've got plenty of questions about it, I just know I'm happier living in this big story that I can at least aspire to maybe 75% believe, and sharing life with these people that also sort of believe this story with me. It gives us a common narrative that orients and directs our community and gives us meaningful things to do together. And so, John, it's been interesting watching John Vervaeke's journey on this, because he very much started with a religion that's not a religion. And he's sort of gotten rid of that now for the same reason as some of these atheist assemblies, that you can't really write a new fairy tale. The fact that these stories are old, the fact that they're enduring, has a quality that we can't really manufacture. It's interesting that when Walt Disney started in the beginning of the 20th century, he did fairy tales. And because these things sort of have a super deep resonance. And so John has sort of moved from a religion that's not a religion to a Silk Road metaphor, by which here is a path by which people they might leave one place on the Silk Road, they might wind up in another place, or a spiritual Silk Road, and find at least a legacy religion that they can begin to start with. They might do some adaptation with it. They might add some little idiosyncratic elements to it, but you just really can't. Your life is too short to actually have time to construct a new religion. So what you begin to discover is that all of these religions have been morphing and changing and differentiating and migrating and evolving over long periods of time, and that it's actually more efficient to re-engage with a religious tradition that is already existing, that has already answered a bunch of basic questions that perhaps for whatever reason aren't in dispute now, and they can engage in some of the things that are being disputed or retinkered or recalibrated. But that's actually a far more efficient way to get out of nihilism into a meaningful community, find a community that, there are in North America. Part of the reason I think churches will see something of a revival from this is there's already a ton of infrastructure. There's already a place that's half used. There's already a parking lot that's only half filled. And you can actually go to a place like this, and there's going to be negotiation with people who have different beliefs. But Americans say they love diversity. And most people who are sort of spiritual but not religious are high in openness. And so, yeah, there's negotiation and compromise. But I'll tell you, any significant family you're involved with is full of negotiation and compromise. If you're going to have a marriage, you're going to learn to negotiate and compromise with your wife. As your children grow into a different world, you're going to have to negotiate and compromise about these new beliefs and ideas that they're bringing, that you as an older person might say, that's a bad idea. But you're going to have to find out your own way. So I'm your dad or your mom, whatever you do. And off we go.
Right. So that's beautiful. And I think what's the interesting thing about, myth and mythos, but myths are just people's religions from the past that we don't recognize anymore, right? But the essential idea of having a shared story of ultimate meaning is really critical. So the challenge is that it's possible for a lot of people to have their individual journeys and feel very satisfied. And And I would say no one here is trying to actually say, hey, you need, if you found meaning, you need to do something else, or there's Christianity has to be the answer or anything like that. It's like, or God has to be the answer is for people. But the challenge is oftentimes there's finding individual meaning and then there's finding meaning in community. Is there a shared story, a shared narrative? Because we're social people, right? And that's the challenge of, we have thousands and millions and billions of individual beautiful souls in their own unique path. But the question is, how do we come together? And people have tried to create stories around, the earth, Gaia, things of that nature. There's been some comments here about, there's three men talking here. What about feminine perspectives on spirituality? Bringing that into the story, right? And the new stories or the updatings of the Christian story or the Buddhist story is bringing more of the feminine feminine energy and the feminine archetypes into that story. They were always there, but not necessarily very highlighted, right? I think it's very important. But that idea of having a shared story is very important. And I think it's, as you said before, it's difficult to construct that and then get other. I can join a group that already has a story versus trying to create one for myself out of whole cloth and then find friends who can then all get together and do that. Now, Humanity Rising in some ways is its own community, trying to do that, of individual unique souls coming together and maybe creating a shared community around this Humanity Rising channel. And so there's thousands of these internet experiments out there, but a lot of people are seeking, as you said before, not having a home, sometimes going back to their Christian traditions, sometimes not doing any of that at all, but finding this estuary as a place for community and healing. And you're willing to keep that space open if they've never come into Christianity whatsoever. And I think that's really part of what the Christian message was supposed to be about anyways from the beginning. It wasn't about maximizing number of people in the pews, right? And growing congregations, right? It's that service element you're talking about. And I think it's very beautiful. And I think, whether someone is interested in Christianity or has been harmed by it, some people have been really harmed by Christianity. You're basically opening up people in an inclusive way. And I think that's important. It's this idea of creating a shared story and a shared myth. You mentioned John Vervaeke in his work. It's sort of interesting. I think I want to emphasize for people that I highlight him because of his incredible brilliance, but also his inhumanity. And that's the quality, I think, of all the people I'm speaking with this week is their humanity and their generosity of spirit, right? And I want to say John Vervaeke has an incredible generosity of spirit. He grew up in a Christian background and was scarred by it enormously. and he's been trying to find an integrity, something from the Greek tradition onwards through Neoplatonism and all that kind of stuff. He's been trying to figure out how to rebuild the meaning-making structure in the West out of the rubble of what's happened. And he's not talking about just the Christian part. He's talking about, the scientific way of making meaning has fallen apart. It's in rubble. I think that's the challenge. As part of we thought, well, the new atheists were thinking science would solve all the answers, right? And it doesn't solve the answers either, right? That's part of the process but the important thing is that we're not going backwards anymore. We're going forward. It's going to be far more participatory estuary process. It's also going to be far more inclusive of all different kind of people, like on your journey of, race and different creeds, but it's also going to be much more inclusive of different sexual identities, of women, of, different global, thought structures and different cultures going forward. And I think that's all part of where the work you're doing in the community you have, even though the primary number of people coming at you are men. There are women that are a part of this community as well, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And this is where the screens distort, because if you go to this little corner, it looks very much like a male space, and you see a few women who pop in. But if you go to in real life estuaries, the gender balance is much more even, because there's something about, so I'm on YouTube a lot, and my wife is a public school educator, and she's got her own axes to grind. And so I'm like, honey, why don't you start a YouTube channel and you can talk about the issues in education you want to talk about? I'm not going on YouTube. Well, why not? Well, there's whole kinds of reasons that she has for not wanting to be on YouTube that I don't even think about. And so, but what I found in estuary, in real life, no cameras on estuary communities is that, well, the women excel because the men, the men are the ones who have to sort of get more comfortable with getting vulnerable and expressing weakness. And of course, in male spaces, expressing weakness, you tend to lose status as a man. Women tend to bond over vulnerability and disclosure. So in real life estuary spaces, men are sort of trying to catch up to the women, but the women have been excelling in those spaces. But again, these are the distortions of a different medium. And so YouTube is definitely a male space. And so actually I have an older sister who is on YouTube, and she's always frustrated because she's like, I look at the YouTube channels that really succeed and they're all these cute young women. And it's like, duh, television figured that out in the 1950s. You want to have a successful network, put young, pretty faces on it. It's just psychology. But when you're into small in-person settings, doesn't matter what you look like, really. In fact, if there's if someone would walk out of a TV set into an estuary group, it would probably distort the process because all the men would be distracted by some young, beautiful woman in the group. And with a whole bunch of very normal people in a room, people can just have a conversation.
Someone made a comment about rebel wisdom. That was an attempt to try to create community. And what's interesting, Paul, is that, rebel wisdom sort of shot up like a candle and then turned into a firework and then disappeared, right?
Yeah. Well, I talked with David. So I know David, and I talked with him when I was in the UK last time, or 2 times ago when I was in the UK. And he part of the difficulty with YouTube is it tends to burn out creators quickly. And there was a big hole that happened when David sort of announced that Rebel Wisdom was, he was gonna close Rebel Wisdom because he wanted to sort of transition it into something much more like, I think, estuary, something more in real life, something more positive and building rather than doing critique of ideas. And what he discovered was that it's getting cameras on people, and there's lots of smart people who can say a lot of interesting things. That's relatively easy. You want to know what's hard? Building community is hard because real community involves the messiness of people. And people are messy, complicated, and often hurtful. And what blows up in real life community is often the hurts that people bring into it, and often when they react badly out of those hurts at each other. And then people are like, well, why do I want to come to this group only to have someone say something nasty about me or ignore me? And so part of what we've tried to build into the estuary protocol is, so we did one meeting in the UK, in the northern UK, and there was one guy who was a YouTuber, and he had sort of a philosophy channel, and he came to that meeting, and we're going around the circle, pitching ideas where to start. And he basically said, I'm here to set you all straight on what you're getting wrong. Oh, well, guess what? Nobody else in the group was terribly interested into hearing him on his soapbox, but he was at least mature enough that he realized very quickly he had to change tack. And this was not a soapbox, a series of successive soapboxes. This was going to be a real face-to-face community, and wound up having a wonderful time discussing other ideas that other people had brought to the group, being able to make some of his own contributions too, but realizing that, if you actually want to have a meaningful, satisfying conversation, you're going to have to show up for it. And you're going to need to have a brave space, not a safe space. You're probably going to hear some ideas you disagree with, but if you're going to be disagreeable, you're not going to get from the group what deep down you really need from the group. And so I've been amazed, like we mentioned the UK here. My friend John Vervaeke and I, we went through the UK and we did estuary meetings with cold groups almost every night. And we never had a blowout. Everybody showed up for the group and they shared and they participated and they listened and they left saying, wow, I didn't know I could sit in a room of 10 other strangers and have a conversation like this. And then the hope is, well, maybe if you can establish a more permanent one, now you've got a group of people who regularly know, I might not go every week, but I can show up at that group at Living Stones at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. We always have an interesting conversation. And we talk about things that, how do I relate to a homeless person? Why is my relationship with my father so contested? How can I understand that? What can I do? And again, once it gets down to that personal level, now people start having skin in the game and can usually show up and behave better towards each other.
And just to jump in here for a moment, and I'd love to get Michael and Paul, both of your perspectives. So if we start with the meta crisis of whether it's climate chaos or so many of the other challenges that we're facing as a society, we're seeing progress being made. We're seeing hopeful signs that some of these meta crises can and will be solved in the next couple of decades, hopefully before it's too late. With the meaning crisis that's very much present, especially in the West, but globally, whether we're talking youth and adolescent anxiety, depression, and suicide, or other indicators of meaning crisis, and we're seeing the work that you're doing, Paul, and that others are doing. I'm curious from both of your perspectives with regard to the meaning crisis. Where are we on the journey? How much progress have we made? How much distance still needs to be covered?
We is a big word. Because if I've watched recently, John Vervaeke did a conversation with Andrew Sweeney and Christopher Mastropietro, which I think was a good indication of John's journey from sort of a religion that's not a religion. Here, I'm going to establish a program that, or at least a template by which communities can sort of piece things together, to what I really need to do is help the different legacy communities and religions relate to each other better so we can have, as John calls, dialogos. Now, I see progress in these spaces, but we is a very big thing. Mm-hmm. And as John Vervaeke talks about, part of what has provoked this was that humanity has had traditional religions and structures that reliably offered meaning for people within the distresses that normal life in this world creates. The distresses were supposed to be eliminated by modernity and technology, but that only really impacts the material aspect of ourselves and not really the spiritual aspect of ourselves. And so, I think we're seeing progress, but the progress has been surprising because basically at the beginning of the 20th century, echoed by the new atheists at the end of the 20th century, religion was supposed to disappear. And John Vervaeke sort of came into the conversation saying, the legacy religions are not enough and they're disappearing anyway. And now he's to the point of saying, actually, we're probably not going to get beyond the legacy religions. What people are going to continue to do is adopt and adapt. And those religious communities are going to continue to evolve. And I suspect, and because when he started this, I knew right away he had a problem of scale, because those of us who have college degrees and probably graduate degrees. We're very adept at frontal lobe thinking, philosophy, all of this. That's like 10, 15% of our society. The rest of our society, I knew that right away his project had a scalability issue, that he can talk about metacognition and distributed consciousness, and he can talk about all of these words, and the normal people that come into my church every day, they just need a story to inhabit. And so even though the meaning crisis goes all the way down to the bottom because of dislocation, disruption of traditional structures, the reason the legacy religions aren't going away is because over thousands of years, these religions have been able to deploy practical answers to everyday people that none of us are going to live long enough to actually recreate. In other words, answers emerge more than are prescribed by people with IQs north of 130.
Right. So I think what's important here is that by design, but also through people like Paul's spirit, there's a generosity of, if people are finding meaning outside of the Christian path and they want to come to an estuary or be part of this little corner of the internet, it's great. It's fine. It's just, I think what he's saying, I think what you're saying, Paul, is that many people are going to basically try to adapt and evolve this multi-thousand-year storehouse, whether it's Hindu or it's Christian or it's Buddhist, you name it, that's already out there and available for people. And what's interesting is that, we had Luke on yesterday talking about his mystical path. He's saying, in some ways, Luke was saying the great tradition he's tapping into is the mystics in the Christian church, and that the mystics in the Hindu religion and the advanced Buddhas in the Buddhist tradition have a lot in common. In sort of funny, Paul, is that if you look from a postmodern, postmodern perspective, oftentimes what you can see is that the mystics tend to agree with each other. The ones who are going the deepest in the path, the ones who you would say walking the path of Christ all the way, right? Trying to be, the call to be saints, right? If someone becomes a saint in the Christian tradition and they meet someone who's trying to become a Buddha in the Buddhist tradition, they tend to meet at the top of the mountain and have an enormous amount in common with each other. I mean, I think that's really a common experience. But the challenge is that I think there's a great ecumenical connection among the mystics. But the question is, if someone's beginning that journey up the mountain, right, they're going to end up oftentimes doing that within a tradition, as you talked about before, in a tradition that's evolving and adapting, responding to all the critiques. I've been trying to focus on the conversation by seeing some of the chats going by where people have talked about all the harm that Christianity has caused, right? And I think you fully acknowledge all of that. The people in this little corner of the internet are not trying to create a pre-modern Christianity that's oppressive. And that is, colonialization of all that structure. So I think there's a universality of love. I think that's one of the things that's critical. There's a universality of love. There's a universality of what we might call the soul and spirit, and that the different traditions are all trying to help people get to that together. And we're trying to find spaces for people. I think one of the things you talked about a lot is social fact, Paul, social fact. And what's interesting is that it used to be a social fact that God was real, and it was in Western worlds, it was a Christian God, right? And now the social fact is there is no God. And it doesn't mean that people don't have other beliefs, but the default setting of society is skepticism of any claim that's what we call supernatural, right? And so what's interesting is that when you have a social fact of it's sort of like we're just evolutionary beings in a material world, it's based on science, and there is no inherent sense of meaning, that social fact exacerbates, Tom, to your question, the meaning crisis, right? We all have to do the work. We all have to find communities. People here are doing that. People at Paul's church are doing that. People in the estuaries are doing that. But if the social fact is that if I have a spiritual experience, I feel uncomfortable sharing it in public, or if I'm a prominent intellectual or a professional in the corporate world, I can't share that. It's an interesting thing of changing this, creating spaces where we have permission to share our experiences, where people can share not just their souls, but also their spiritual journey. And I think part of the process of this little corner of the internet, the estuary process, is to create places for community, but also to create places where the social facts are changed, where it's permissible to share the spiritual aspects of the self, whereas it's sort of vaguely uncomfortable. Like, you're not supposed to talk about politics in, politics and religion at work, can there be a place where people can bring their spiritual selves? And I think the estuary process does that.
So I mentioned the Freddie and Paul show when I started. If your meaning crisis project doesn't include something that helps people with IQs below 100,
yeah,
it's, we like to focus on inclusivity and breaking barriers. So much of, and even estuary, I mean, Freddie can't really participate in estuary. It's just not at his level of cognition. Now, to participate in estuary, you don't need to know all of the fancy Vervaeke words. You don't need to be able to understand, Jonathan Pageau's symbolism and all of the stuff that you would see a lot on Rebel Wisdom. But your meaning crisis solution is going to have to be able to engage people who, basically could never really get out of high school. They don't have that level. And so that's part of the reason the legacy religions won't go away, because whereas you could find advanced Christian mystics in monasteries, those are single-digit percentages of the community. And that's the same in Buddhism. It's the same in Hinduism. Every single religious tradition that has actually afforded meaning throughout the history of the world had ways that afforded meaning and community and all the necessary things in life for people, for the 80% who have IQs less than 115. And if your project is really for people who are either exceptionally spiritual by temperament or exceptionally intellectual by birth, you're just going to have, and I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Intellectuals need their communities too. But as a Christian minister, because I deal, and my father and my grandfather have always lived in communities that were distressed, you begin to realize that sample bias by zip code is enormous. And if you might establish something that people with resources and money and time can participate in and feel good about, but 80% of the world, I don't know, 80% of the world has IQs below 115, 120. If you cannot help 80% of the world, how inclusive is your project? That's just a fact.
Yeah, picking up on that point, Paul, about inclusivity, and something that you've been doing a great job of framing this week, Michael, around the future of God is in developmental, participatory, and relational. How do we return to the place where people are prepared to plant trees that they'll never enjoy the shade in their lifetime? How do we get to that place? And Paul, part of what I'm hearing in your work with estuaries, that's exactly what you're doing. And I'm wondering if either of you have more to share in that regard.
Well, this is where some of the inconvenient differences between the legacy religious communities tend to appear. Because, for example, you can go to an estuary meeting, find a viable community that helps you deal with your relationship with your Father, improve your life in this little realm right now between birth and death, make your journey from 0 to 100 more meaningful, more pleasurable, better community. You can improve that space. Part of the reason churches are so filled with older people is not just because Christianity has been on decline in the West. That is part of the truth. But I have baptized a number of people in their 70s. And the reason they came to church was, what happens to me after I die? Now, again, this is a nearly universal anxiety. All of the legacy religions offer, deal with this question, but most secular approaches won't deal with it. And so churches forever have begun meeting needs within the frame of people's lives, but then offering a narrative that they can live into that actually deals with, what about after I die? Is there hope for this world? Now, you may believe or not believe in the narratives that these particular legacy religions give you, because those answers are very different. But at least they have answers for that. And part of why modernity has failed is that basically, maybe are we really going to escape climate change? Are we really, we managed to duck nuclear disaster during the Cold War, but is it feasible that we will actually avoid nuclear proliferation? And, now with the war in Ukraine, possible war in Taiwan, it's like people need answers that go beyond the grave. Traditional religions have these things. Most things that have sort of been born out of secular don't. And so, again, this is a big part of the package that people with regular lives, how do I know? And again, why should I have children? Well, my parents had me, not too long after the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was a scary thing. And so, again, I think this is part of the reason why legacy religions aren't going to go away.
So if I hear what you're saying, Paul, in some ways, the challenge of getting people to think long-term about planting trees they'll never see, which is Tom's question, is that if people are closed in on themselves and closed in about maximizing their life alone and not thinking about, even if someone, even if we take away the Christian language completely about heaven and all that kind of stuff, right? But what happens is, if people think that's nonsense, and it's okay if they do right now, if heaven's nonsense or the afterlife is nonsense, but if someone has that belief, that makes them think about more than their life, right? For example, someone might say, well, I've got children to think about. Well, people don't have children, right? So what am I thinking about beyond my life if I don't have successors? And if they have an immortal soul, then what it does is it makes them think about more than themselves and more than this life. And then people who think that way are much more likely to respond to, I am willing to invest my time and treasure, not just in this life or in my 401k, but to giving my time and efforts to things that Tom's talking about, which is planting trees, helping other people across the world, and doing the best of what the legacy religions and Christianity was supposed to do, not the worst of what it did. The best intentions of what Christianity was trying to do was helping people around the world when they weren't colonizing them and oppressing them, but actually trying to offer service, education, care for other people that they may never meet, people they may never know. So if someone has a framework of eternity, then they're going to invest in other people they never know, people who are not their family, people who are not themselves, and future generations they may never meet. And it can be done by other people who are completely secular and don't believe in God whatsoever. But it's a lot easier with God. Is that what you're really trying to say?
Yeah. Even before Christianity had any political power, part of the reason Christianity stole the culture of the Roman Empire was every time a plague would hit a city, reasonable people would flee, because if a plague hits the city, get out of town. We all know this after COVID. Christians, because they believed in a resurrection, you may agree or disagree with that idea, but because they believed in a resurrection, They stayed in the city and cared not only for the sick within their own families, they cared for the pagan sick too. And because people were cared for, they tended to have a higher survivability rate. Many of those Christians stayed and cared for people at the cost of their lives. And those who survived woke up and said, my family members who give sacrifices in all these pagan temples fled me, but that doggone Christian who believes in the resurrection stayed. And you know what? Those people would tend to become Christians. And so even if you might not share a Christian's belief in the resurrection, you still might want to have that Christian living next door to you, because that Christian believes that, well, what I give in this life is only rewarded to me in the next. So you can doubt that narrative, but I think evolutionarily, you can even look at a narrative structure like that and say, wow, if you've got a lot of people living in a community that have a narrative structure like that, that community is planting trees for tomorrow. And actually the whole community rises, which again is why the legacy religions are still there, because evolutionarily they outperform individualism. And people might look at Andrew Tate and say, wow, he's got all these girls, yada yada yada. But you remember Hugh Hefner when he was like 70, 80 years old and he's still chasing 20-year-old blondes? You remember how sleazy and just awful that looked? And then you say, look at an old couple where it's a man and a woman and they've been together for 60 years and they love each other. Which old man do you really want to be? And which narrative structure affords a couple who's been married for 60 years versus a dude in silk pajamas, taking all kinds of things to try and act like he's still 20 years old? And that's what these legacy religions have been able to afford.
Right. So, Paul, I think this has been a remarkable conversation. And I think what I hear from you again and again and again is that there's a lot of, you talk about thinky-talky, people were doing intellectual explorations of what postmodernity is and metamodernism, but whatever solution we have, and what you're saying is that the legacy religions are likely going to be a storehouse for the rest of the 21st century of meaning making, but in a very different way that's evolutionary, inclusive, is not going back to the past and not going back to the bad past. But whatever solution comes up, whether it was a new religion or a new thought process, if it doesn't reach everybody, if it doesn't serve the real needs of people, if it doesn't give them a hope for the future, it's not a good solution. And that's sort of like the criteria is, if you can't deal with the disabled, the poor, the average person, and in a world that's meritocratic, we have this horrible meritocratic society, which is wonderful. It celebrates success, but it means most people feel like they're losers in the current meaning making system. It's like it's not intentional, but it's by design. If you have a meritocracy, then secular people will say, then most people feel like they're losers, and you have to have a situation where everybody wins and everyone believes they win. And everybody treats each other as critical, as beautiful souls that matter. And any meaning-making system that can do that going forward is probably worth celebrating. And if it happens to be an evolution of Christianity or Hinduism or something brand new, you're trying to create through estuary these spaces that are true to those principles of meaning-making, that everybody belongs. Everybody matters, and that building that messy community is the essence of life. I think that's what I really hear from you, Paul.
Yeah, that's right.
I want to thank you so much for being here today. And then I know a lot of people had comments and questions, and now they can just get in the after chat and they can just ask Paul directly.
Yep, absolutely. And again, I'm very available. Well, not as available as I'd like to be. That's part of the problem of success is you can't be as available as you'd like to be. I'm very available in person, but on the internet, a little harder. But
well, thank you, Paul. It's been a wonderful.
Delighted to have you with us today, Paul, and thank you for helping us engage in this conversation around if the future of God is developmental, participatory, and relational. What does that actually look like? What does that actually mean? And clearly, the estuaries that you were fostering are bringing meaning to that in a beautiful way and making a huge impact in people's lives. So thank you.
My pleasure.
And Michael, thank you again for bringing together a fantastic week, and looking forward to our time tomorrow. For those who are able to join us, we've got another delightful conversation. Tomorrow we'll be joined by Jan Byers. So
I'll say something quickly. Someone asked about David Bohm multiple times in dialogue. Jan's going to be talking about David Bohm. She's going to be talking from a female perspective. She'll be talking about the female mystics, and she's going to be talking a lot of the questions you raised. Jan will be talking about them tomorrow. So just want to let you know. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone, and see you tomorrow.